Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the Holocaust. So questions to consider as we move through this video. What is anti-Semitism? What is the Holocaust? What are the three stages of the Holocaust? What are concentration camps and what were their purposes? And then finally, what groups were specifically targeted during the Holocaust? So on this slide, you see all of the key terms you should look for throughout this video. All of these terms will be in bold, blue, and underline. So before we start talking about the Holocaust, it's important to revisit this idea of what exactly Nazism is. Nazism is a combination of extreme nationalism and racism. Nazis not only believe in the superiority of Germany, they also believe in the superiority of what they think of as the white Aryan race. So what exactly is that racial ideology of the Third Reich? So Nazis embraced sort of this pseudoscience that we see sort of throughout the late 19th century. And their specific pseudoscience viewed Jews as a race whose members are sort of locked in combat with the Aryan race for world domination, the Aryan race being the white race. And so Nazis believe in this racial superiority of the Aryan race. There's a lot of roots in social Darwinism, which we looked at when we looked at imperialism. But we can define Aryan as a racial grouping that emerged in the period of the late 19th century to mid 20th century to describe people of the Indo-European heritage or the Germanic peoples. Now, Aryan really does not mean that. It actually refers to the Indo-European peoples who began to migrate into the Indian subcontinent. But this use of the word Aryan sort of becomes used within Nazi Germany to sort of differentiate the Germanic peoples from sort of everybody else. And any non-Germanic people, including Jews, including the Slavic people, were considered inferior to those Aryan Germanic individuals. So sort of based on this idea of Germanic superiority, Germanic people superiority, Aryan superiority, Hitler believes that all groups of people sort of carry within them traits that are passed from one generation to the next. So there are sort of these genetic inherent traits within certain groups of people, within the Germanic people, within Slavic people, within the Jewish population, and that no individual could overcome the qualities of his or her race. So if you are born a Slav, you have certain inherited characteristics and that you cannot overcome them. That is the sort of foundation of Hitler's beliefs. Along those same lines, assimilation or sort of bringing in different groups to a culture is impossible because those original inherited traits cannot change. So trying to assimilate the Slavic people into Germanic culture is impossible because those Slavs will still have traits that make them inferior, according to Adolf Hitler. And so the Holocaust is an event that takes this racial ideology to the extreme. And the Holocaust is a systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jewish men, women, and children by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. the Holocaust is an event that decimates the Jewish population in Europe, and 75 plus years later, that population still has not recovered. So there are three steps when we think about the Holocaust. It sort of starts out with persecution. We see that there are anti-Semitic laws that are passed. We see that there are acts of violence directed to the Jewish population in Germany, and ultimately surrounding countries as Adolf Hitler moves into new territory. So that first step is really prosecution, limiting rights, limiting what those individuals can do, and then there are many acts of violence directed to those groups of people. The second step is isolation. So it is not enough just to sort of label and persecute individuals who are Jewish. You are now isolating those populations from everybody else. And Nazi Germany did this through ghettos, sort of bringing in an entire Jewish population to live in a certain part of the city. And then also, this is when we start to see concentration camps being used. And concentration camps could be forced labor camps, but we're also going to see that concentration camps can become something else. And then finally, the third stage of the Holocaust is extermination. So it is not enough to persecute or isolate. Individuals must be killed. Individuals must be murdered. And so we see this extermination stage sort of take on multiple roles. We see that there are going to be mobile death squads going around from town to town, murdering Jewish men, women, and children. We see death camps, the most famous of which is Auschwitz. And then finally, we'll also see death marches towards the end of the war, when it becomes very clear that Germany will not win the war. We see that there are men, women, and children sort of marched from various concentration and death camps in an effort to kill them. So it's important to understand what exactly anti-Semitism is before we start talking about these three stages in depth. Anti-Semitism is, simply put, discrimination against Jews. It's hostility to, prejudice, discrimination against Jews as a racial or religious group. Again, remember, Nazi ideology is sort of rooted in racism, and they have classified the Jewish people as a race. It is Judaism is a religion, and what we're going to see is that Nazi Germany sort of classifies individuals who have left the Jewish faith as Jewish because of their family background. And what's important to note is that anti-Semitism has existed for centuries in Europe and around the world before the rise of the Third Reich. So some examples of anti-Semitism before World War II include the Crusades, Crusaders as they are moving to take the Holy Land back from the Muslim faith. Crusaders massacre many Jewish communities along the way to Jerusalem. We see that various Jewish communities are expelled from countries around Europe So Jews are forced to leave countries including Spain, France, England, and Austria, and many will eventually settle in Poland. And Poland during the Holocaust is actually going to see the Holocaust impact its Jewish community the most. So the Jewish people who have been expelled from all of these countries sort of find a home in Poland, and that is going to have a pretty big impact on the Jewish population in Poland. We see that the Black Plague, as the Black Plague spreads, Jews are used as scapegoats for the spread of the disease, even though they are affected sort of at the same rate. Spanish Inquisition, in order to prevent conversos, as they were called, from engaging in Jewish practices, the Spanish Inquisition sort of tried to get people to turn on their neighbors. Martin Luther and the Reformation. Martin Luther is originally sympathetic to the Jewish population, but became increasingly anti-Semitic when his attempts at conversion failed. We see that the Dreyfus Affair in France, a Jewish military officer is used as a scapegoat in a treason case, and it becomes very obvious that he is a scapegoat. And then finally, we see pogroms, which are violent, organized riots aimed at the massacre or persecution of an ethnic or religious group. And we see that there are many, many pogroms, not only throughout Europe, but also specifically in Russia. So anti-Semitism, this idea of persecuting Jews, begins to influence German law once Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933. So it has been around in Europe for centuries, but once Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, anti-Semitism finds its way into laws. And most notably, the Nuremberg laws are passed in 1935. And the Nuremberg laws define who is Jewish. Now, earlier in this video, I talked about how Judaism is a religion, but Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany begin to define Jews as a race as well, because racism is sort of at the foundation of Nazism. And so the Nuremberg laws defined a Jew as anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. So Judaism, again, is reframed as not only a religion, but also a race. So individuals who had converted away from Judaism, who left the Jewish faith, are now considered Jewish if their grandparents are Jewish. We see the introduction of the term Mischling, which is a legal term for someone who has both Aryan and Jewish ancestry. Those Nuremberg laws also stripped Jews of German citizenship. It prohibited marriage between Jews and German. And Jews are also forbidden from displaying a national or Reich flag. So the Nuremberg laws really begin to separate who is Jewish or who is considered Jewish and who is not. So on this slide, we see sort of a poster that goes into detail about who is considered Jewish, who is considered a Mischling, and who is considered sort of pure Aryan. And so again, what's important to note about the Nuremberg laws is it is reframing Judaism as a race. It is reframing who is considered Jewish. So even individuals who had converted away from the religion are now considered Jewish because a grandparent was Jewish. So other anti-Semitic laws that we see are passed during this first part of the Holocaust. We see Jews are prohibited from holding public office or civil servant positions. They can't seek employment in the press and radio. They cannot farm. They are excluded from stock exchanges and hospital stock brokerage. They're prohibited from using hospitals. So if you get sick, you cannot go to the hospital. You cannot be educated past the age of 14. You can't use public entities like parks, libraries, beaches. Jewish names are erased from war memorials. Jews with, quote, non-Jewish first names are forced to adopt names like Israel or Sarah for identification purposes. So Jews are stripped of their names and given other names for identification purposes, and they cannot own businesses. So this is a systemic stripping away of Jewish rights, to begin to isolate them, to label them, to persecute them. And this sort of comes to a violent head on the night of November 9th. Kristallnacht is referred to as the Night of the Broken Glass, and Hitler orders an attack on Jewish communities using the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jewish boy sort of as a pretense. But it was a well-organized wave of violence that destroyed homes, synagogues, businesses, and it's considered a pogrom, sort of that well-organized violence against a specific groups. Thousands of Jews are arrested and made to pay for that damage. So here we see a picture of a synagogue burning on the night of Kristallnacht. The damage, again, was extensive, and Jews were the ones who paid to clean up that damage. So after this sort of persecution stage, stripping individuals of their rights, stripping them of their citizenship in particularly, we start to see the Nazi Party begin to isolate the Jewish community. And they begin to isolate those Jewish communities into ghettos. And a ghetto is a part of a city in which members of a minority group live, typically as the result of social, legal, or economic pressure. And we see that ghettos really begin with the invasion of Poland in 1939. Nazis sealed off ghettos with barbed wire, stone walls, and the living conditions were brutal. There are multiple families living in single-family apartments. There are limited food rations. So it is quite possible that you have families that, 6 or 7 people living with other families of 6 or 7 people in a single-family apartment. Not a house, an apartment. And so we start to see the movement away from just simply labeling and persecuting. We are starting to see these groups isolated. And it's around this time that this idea of a final solution sort of comes into play. It is not enough to persecute. It is not enough to isolate. There begin to be talks of exterminating the Jewish people and other undesirable groups in the Third Reich. And so the final solution is the Nazi plan for the deliberate and systematic genocide of all Jews within reach of Nazi Germany. So this is sort of part of Hitler's plan to take over as much territory as he can in Europe. So there were many things that the Nazis started to do to implement the final solution. There were mobile death squads, concentration camps, death marches. And so the Nazis are really taking every step they can to eliminate an entire group of people. So the Einsatzgruppen are the mobile death squads. And it's a mobile killing unit made up of Nazi SS units and the police. The Einsatzgruppen's job was to kill as many Jews as they could find in the occupied Soviet territory, which included Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, certain parts of Poland. And we see that these individuals are shot or gassed and then buried in mass graves. Many times they are forced to dig their own grave before being shot or gassed. And the Einsatzgruppen murdered more than 1 million Jews and tens of thousands of other innocent people, other civilians, other undesirable groups, according to the Nazi regime. So the Einsatzgruppen is sort of instrumental in carrying out this final solution. So concentration camps sort of go along in this isolation phase in addition to the extermination phase. And we see that concentration camps, we sort of think of them simply as death camps, but there are many different types of concentration camps. It is a camp in which people are detained or confined, usually with harsh conditions, and there are really no legal norms to the arrest and imprisonment. People are sort of simply taken and sent to these camps. So the purpose of concentration camps, sort of from the beginning, and we see that the first concentration camp is built sort of shortly after Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933. But the concentration camp sort of originally served to put for 3 goals. First, to incarcerate people the Nazi regime perceived to be a security threat. Secondly, to eliminate individuals and target sort of small groups by way of murder away from the public. And then finally, they were used as forced labor camps. There is a labor shortage in Germany, and concentration camps are a way to hold people prisoner and also have forced labor. So probably the most well-known concentration camp is Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is a complex of over 40 concentration and death camps that are operated by Nazi Germany in Poland. It is a huge complex where many things happened. Auschwitz I is a concentration camp, a forced labor camp with individuals being held and doing labor. Auschwitz II Birkenau is considered a death camp whose purpose was to murder as many people as possible on a daily basis. So SS and the police deported at least 1.3 million people to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, and approximately 1.1 people were murdered at Auschwitz. So Jews from nearly every European country were deported to Auschwitz. So everywhere Hitler took territory, we see the Jewish populations of those areas are sent to Auschwitz. And Zyklon B is first used at Auschwitz, and this is the gas that was used to kill millions and millions of people during the Holocaust. It's chosen as the means of mass murder due to its conversion as a lethal gas when exposed to air. So you may have heard of groups of people being told that, you've had a long journey, we're going to let you shower, we'll give you clean clothes, and, hundreds of people being forced into showers and having this gas released. And so it is the way that Nazi Germany decided to kill millions and millions of people during this time. So this is a map of Auschwitz. So we see that the first camp is down here. And again, that is a concentration camp, forced labor camp. And we see that Auschwitz II is really built to be a death camp with various rail lines built to drive sort of directly into Auschwitz II. And then we also see that Auschwitz III is over here again as a labor camp, helping to build arms for the Nazis. So the persecuted groups during the Holocaust, it is not just Jews. Jews, by the end of the Holocaust, will have lost 6 million people, but there is another 6 million people who are also killed because they are also persecuted by the Nazis. They are seen as inferior to the Aryan race. And those groups include the Roma, who are also referred to as gypsies, individuals with physical and mental disabilities, Slavic peoples, especially Poles and Russians, Soviet prisoners of war, individuals who are considered Black, communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, political dissidents, anyone who was not a supporter of Hitler's policies, anyone who is considered inferior by race, anyone who does not support the Third Reich is persecuted and killed. So in total, roughly 12 million people, 6 million of which were Jews, are murdered at the hands of the Nazis. And so it is incredibly important to sort of recognize how the Holocaust happened, because these 12 million, it did not go from, Hitler becomes chancellor and the final solution is enacted. It is a systemic, step-by-step process to isolate these communities, to persecute these communities, to label these communities in order to separate them from community. And so the key takeaways from this video: Nazi Germany took calculated, escalating steps to isolate the European Jewish community, beginning with anti-Semitic laws and ending with the mass murder of 6 million Jews and overall 12 million people. Other persecuted groups include the Roma, Slavic people, prisoners of war, political dissidents, and countless others who are deemed inferior by the Nazis, adding another 6 million deaths. And finally, Auschwitz was the most notorious of concentration camps, with approximately 1.1 million people murdered within the complex within 5 years. So I know that this is probably one of the harder videos to watch in this unit. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all later.